All right, today we want to talk about some questions from our students, and we're thankful that you sent these in. We're just going to go through these in no particular order, and we're not really going to talk about who sent them in. So we'll lay them out there, and my guess is if one person's asking them, some other people probably are wondering too. And Tim and I are going to take turns on some of this and then share some answers together and probably have some discussion along the way. So we'll begin with this question for Dr. Brokaw. Who are Paul's mother and father?
We don't know.
That's about the only answer we can give, isn't it?
But I think I was thinking about this, and I hadn't warned you about it. That it's a good question if you go. It's a good question either way, but it's a question that opens the doors to trying to understand the person of Paul.
Right. I agree. Yeah.
And for that reason, it's a very important question. We can't answer specifics about Paul's mother and father, but we can ask the question, what do we know about Paul? And I wrote down just a few, and
Yeah.
I don't have chapter and verse on these. This is all from memory, but he does tell us Philippians 3. Well, first of all, we know his name's Saul, right? From Acts, end of Acts 7.
Right.
And then beginning of, and then Acts 9. We know his name was Saul, which, it struck me today when I was thinking about this. Oftentimes when we look at King Saul and we use him as a negative example, which he's portrayed that way, but yet 1,000 years afterwards, people from the tribe of Benjamin are still naming their son Saul.
He's their only hero, right?
Right. He's the hero of the tribe of Benjamin, the first king. Paul tells us he's from the tribe of Benjamin, Philippians 3. He most likely had the second name, Paulus, Greek,
Right.
which is Paul. That's not, we often talk about him changing names. Would you agree? Probably he had both names. He was given both names. That was very typical.
Common, right? Very common.
Common. He's born and raised in Tarsus, which Asia Minor, modern day Turkey. I didn't have the opportunity. I reviewed some of N.T. Wright. By the way, N.T. Wright's Pauli biographies.
Excellent resource for this.
Yeah. Excellent for putting some pieces together. You have to, you may not agree. He doesn't know about everything, but
and I think it's pretty accessible too. It's not an overly technical work.
What's written for
right
lay people.
And I've had people in my church read it and appreciate it. So I think it's something that people can make their way through.
Right. He connects the dots in ways that I was like, oh yeah.
Yeah.
Why didn't I connect the dots that way?
Agreed.
Paul's born and raised in Tarsus, which is a cosmopolitan area, right?
Right.
So you have the Jewish community in Tarsus, but he's being raised among Gentiles, right? Paul's much more so than probably the original 12 disciples or apostles. So he's able to walk the talk.
Yeah.
Right. And understand Gentile culture a little better. That's we have learned in the last 50 to 100 years. Galilee wasn't nearly the backwoods that we sometimes portray it as. It was a much more cosmopolitan area than we sometimes think. Cosmopolitan referring to cities and city areas. But I do think to that regard, Paul's upbringing would have given him an inroad to Gentile culture and understanding Gentile culture and Greek philosophy. Sometimes we see in Paul's letters him quoting Greek historians, Greek philosophers.
Right. And again, in a way that we don't know that any other apostle would have, because they just didn't have access to it.
Dr. Tabor, Charles Tabor, was my missions professor at Emmanuel, and he's with the Lord now and has earned his reward, or received his reward, possibly, or at least will in the next,
Right.
when the new heavens and new earth are established. But I remember him saying, you know, God sent Paul to Athens. He didn't send Peter. Peter
Right.
would have freaked out. Peter couldn't have handled it. It probably wasn't Dr. Tabor's language, but Peter could not have handled Athens, right? And Paul was able
Right.
to do that. We know he was born a Roman citizen because of the status of the city of Tarsus. He
Right.
tells the Roman soldier that. He studied under Gamaliel. I
Right.
think that's Philippians 3. So he was exposed to rabbinic teaching at the very highest. N.T. Wright, in his first chapter, when he talks about Paul's early years, talks about Paul being raised in a culture of zeal, where, you know, Phineas, who killed the man who took the Moabite woman into the tent, was their example. And Paul says he was zealous. When Paul says he was zealous, he's meaning it in that context.
Right.
We know he has a sister whose son, his nephew, heard of the plot against Paul's life, was living in Jerusalem, warned Paul about it. And in my mind, I hadn't really thought of this. It's possible the nephew is studying in Jerusalem,
Right.
under Gamaliel himself. He's a Pharisee. What does that mean? Well, he already believes in the resurrection of the dead, differently than the resurrection of Jesus, of one person, because it would have happened at the end of time, of the righteous. But he's not a Sadducee who doesn't believe in the resurrection. And then, of course, we know he meets Jesus on the road to Damascus. We know about his imprisonments as we follow his letters in Acts. The whole point in this little exercise, real quickly, is just to suggest a couple things that question opens us up to. First of all, if we look closely at Paul's life, we begin to realize why he was hand-chosen by God to be the disciple or the apostle to the Gentiles.
Right.
Right. And we also understand, and this is where, again, I would send readers to Paul, a biography, or other commentaries or dictionaries. It gives us an opportunity to delve a little bit into Paul's background and to understand the context in which he was raised.
Which I think is really helpful. I mean, it's good to read what we know of Paul in Acts. I mean, we need that side of it, but to have a little bit of that background, which Wright does a really good job of giving us, I think, in that book. But and you can get it other places too. But that's a really, it's all right there in one volume.
He synthesizes it.
He does. That's right.
Yeah.
That's a good way.
Which means he brings it together, which is, I think, what you said, and I should have just stuck with that word.
No, that's good. That's good. But it's helpful for us to think through those things that make Paul who he is, and then do make sense when he's in Athens, do make sense when he's speaking before the Sanhedrin. You know, he's able to relate to both those contexts because of who he is, his background, which is pretty unique.
Yeah. He also uses the fact that he's raised a Pharisee and believes in the resurrection as a way to get the Pharisees and the Sadducees arguing.
Agreed. Yeah, right.
Are you ready for what we list as question 2?
Yeah.
All right, I'll read it. And
go ahead. Yeah, do it.
We'll do it that way. How's
that?
Yeah,
that's fine.
All right. So my question is on Colossians 2:16. The writer says, "Therefore," here's part of the quote. "Therefore, do not let someone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival." And here's really the question about it. Doesn't it give too much freedom to immature Christians to act in ways that make it difficult to reach out to outsiders? And I found his analogy and his example very enlightening. I noted that some situations demand one to conform to some societal norms in order to have the opportunity to speak. For example, Muslims would not want a woman to talk to them without a head cover, a hijab. Did I pronounce that correct?
I think so.
Can you help me get a better understanding of the verse, especially in regards to application? So Dr. Jones?
Well, I don't think this is an easy one because we're talking about so many different possible contexts that we might find ourselves in, right? I mean, what exact context might it be? It might be among Muslims, it might be somebody else. But I guess part of my response comes later in the letter. In Colossians 4, and I know our students are familiar with this because many of them have commented on it. Paul says this in verse 5, be wise in the way you act toward outsiders, make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. So Paul does say, hey, don't get so caught up in the rules and regulations that somebody puts on you. And, you should not feel judged by them. You should not allow them to judge you. On the other hand, Paul also says, if you got an opportunity to talk about Jesus, you need to make the most of the opportunity. And if we're violating cultural norms, we're probably going to lose our voice. We're probably going to be unable to communicate because, maybe it does have to do with a head covering of some kind or some other cultural norm. If we violate that, people will not listen. So I think that's the key, especially as we think about how we relate to those that we want to talk with Jesus about. I don't know any better way to answer that because, Paul does say, hey, don't get so caught up in this that you follow all these rules that somebody puts on you. But we certainly do want to be ready to talk about Jesus. Okay, what do you think? Add to that.
I would take a step back and look at the broad issue, which is interpreting scripture in its context.
Yep.
And which is very difficult with that passage because we aren't sure about the context.
Right. We're reading between the lines, as we've said all the way through.
We're reading between the lines, and as a couple commentators say, in effect, they know, we don't. But if you think about context and place that passage in context, Paul's talking about a very specific issue. We do have to be careful about maturity and immaturity.
Right.
I think to interpret it in that way about not being judged by what you eat or drink is taking a statement, an imperative, out of its context, and if you try to apply it to every situation, you're going to apply it incorrectly.
Right.
Is that a fair statement?
Oh, I agree. Yeah.
And it's like those two passages, and I think it's Proverbs 26 that are almost back to back. In which it says it's better to. This is Abraham Lincoln, but it's in effect what the proverb says. It's better to be silent and be thought a fool, and then 2 verses later, he's saying, speak up or people will think you're.
Yeah.
Right. So, which is true. Well, both are true in their individual cultural context or experience context. So, but certainly we're holding this in tension. Also, don't you see it as being internal, external?
Yeah, I think there's truth in that. And I almost brought that up. I think that's right.
Yeah.
How are we responding to other Christians or insiders who may try to put rules and regulations versus what are we doing to make sure we have a voice to those that we need to share Jesus with? So, yeah, I think you're right.
I appreciate the question. It brought up a cultural issue that we don't experience very often.
Right.
In terms of, we have a lot of Muslims in our country, but perhaps you and I aren't having daily interaction with them.
Right. And I think
sisters in Africa are.
As far as that goes, not just that particular subgroup or whatever, the idea is we don't want to we don't want to be purposefully offensive to any
Yeah.
group of people around us, right? I mean, whether it involves maybe alcohol or the use of alcohol or dress or certain foods that if you're sitting down with someone they would really object to. I wouldn't want to choose that food if I have choices that would cause them to be offended by what I've done. And that's just being respectful of people in general, I think, which we want to do. But anyhow.
Well, and flipping it internally real quickly, let us not forget that elsewhere Paul writes, "Don't use your freedom to destroy others."
Right. Yeah, that's right.
So is that Romans 14, or there's a couple of places where he indicates that.
No, that's
So,
a good point. Yeah.
you could layer that on top of the passage from Colossians and I think get a better rounded understanding of what Paul's trying to say.
Right. Right. Okay. The next one's for Dr. Brokaw. Let's think about this. And this is one that has seemingly come up multiple times, both in terms of course, has been in the lectures and then in some of our discussion through WhatsApp, just back and forth. And I understand why, because I have struggled over the years to get a good handle on this myself, because it's a little slippery. So the question is this. In the book of Colossians, we're told of Gnosticism. What is this? Well, we've said maybe this is Gnosticism, maybe it's not, but nonetheless, Gnosticism, at least pre-Gnosticism or something like that, shows up in other places in the New Testament, and trying to understand exactly what we're talking about, I think, is a challenge. So, Dr. Brokaw, we're going to let you lay that out a little bit.
Yeah, and for the original hearers of this video, it's obvious because I addressed this a little bit in the WhatsApp discussion.
Yeah.
And it's obvious I didn't do a very good job because I wasn't clear. But I reviewed my answer and I realized I was presuming some pre-knowledge that was unfair to presume. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do.
So I shared this with Dr. Jones. I reviewed my answer there. I would encourage you, if you're part of this original class, to reread the passage from Bird and Wright that Dr. Jones included. But here's an attempt to clarify what Gnosticism is. Gnosticism is a philosophical and religious pattern of thinking. Philosophical referring to philosophy, and religious, of course, religion. Pattern of thinking which has its roots in Greek and Oriental, meaning Mid-Eastern thought, dating back, this is my opinion, at least 3 centuries before Christ. So it has its roots there. It's just the seeds are there.
Right.
Actually, that maybe seeds is actually a better word than roots there, because roots.
Yeah, right. It is. Yeah, that's right.
So, which has its seeds in Greek and Oriental thought dating back at least 3 centuries before Christ. However, what we might call fully developed Gnosticism does not begin to develop until at least late in the New Testament period, what we sometimes refer to as the 1st century of our era, of the Common Era. And what we know as Gnosticism, fully developed Gnosticism, does not appear until the 2nd and 3rd centuries. So what I'm saying there is we're only getting development of what we call fully developed Gnosticism toward the end of the New Testament period, the 1st century. But even that would be a pre-Gnosticism, or as you reference it, a proto-Gnosticism. We really don't think of Gnosticism as a developed thought pattern until 100 years after Jesus.
Right.
And maybe later.
Right.
Thus, Gnosticism is not the heresy. This is just relating it to Colossians. Gnosticism is not the heresy which Paul confronts in Colossians. We talk about that in the WhatsApp discussion. There may be some hints of it, but it's not what we call Gnosticism.
Right. And we talked about that in the lecture, a couple of the lectures as well. But it does show up in the New Testament, at least in this sort of infancy form, if you will, that takes, and the early church does have to deal with Gnosticism in the 2nd century. It becomes a big problem. So it is there, but not as much in the 1st century as even I think some scholars thought. You go back,
Oh gosh, yeah.
you go back to some commentaries from 50, 75 years ago, and you see a lot more of that discussion than we do now because we've learned more. So
Well,
that's one of the
I
things.
mentioned in the second in the WhatsApp discussion that we have this discovery called, what is it, the Nag Hammadi
Yeah,
scrolls, which was found in a community in Egypt. 1945 is the date I remember seeing.
Yep.
Well, the scholarship for the next 20 years saw Gnosticism everywhere.
Right.
Because we didn't know we didn't really know much about Gnosticism. The only thing we knew about it came from Irenaeus and Tertullian and other Christian writers in the 2nd and 3rd centuries who are arguing against this nebulous, this vague way of thinking that we don't know much about. And so you're reversing it, right? You're trying to read back into it. Well, then we find these documents, including the gospel, what's called the Gospel of Thomas, and other Gnostic teachings. And so naturally, when that door opened, everybody was like, oh, well, what Paul's dealing with is Gnosticism, and what maybe John in 1 John's dealing with is Gnosticism. And while there may be elements of it, it's not the whole thing.
Right.
And it took us a while to us, scholarship to kind of come to those conclusions.
Yeah.
All right, I have a second paragraph.
Oh, okay. Go ahead. Sorry.
Which is Gnosticism is marked by several characteristics. I don't have all of them in front of me. I'd have to do more study on it. But the name Gnosticism, Gnosis, is gnosis, comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. And you notice, by the way, the G is silent. So it's like it's not there. So the name comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. It receives that name because Gnosticism, in its fully fledged form, taught that one could only encounter deity. I struggled with how to say that, but we'll leave it. One could only encounter deity due to a secret knowledge,
Right.
which only the participants in the sect, SECT, referring to the religious group, could gain. A second characteristic of Gnosticism is that it is marked by a pronounced dualism. D-U-A-L-I-S-M. Dualism. Dualism referring to two. That dualism sees flesh as being evil and spirit as being good. And without going into further detail, this was the church's primary interaction with Gnosticism. That Gnostics taught that Jesus could not have been fully human because he could not have taken on human flesh because flesh is evil. Is that a fair statement, you
Right.
think?
Which is sort of a Platonic thought. I mean, that thinking comes from Plato. So it's developed
Yes.
over a period of several hundred years,
Which
this
is
takes
why I
time.
say the seeds of Gnosticism
There you go. Right.
go back 3 centuries
Yeah.
before Christ. Because I see in it a reflection of Platoism.
Yep.
And
I think the scholars do. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're right with
And
that.
finally, my last statement is this causes the fact that Jesus could not have taken on human flesh because flesh is evil according to Gnostic teaching. And there's some really wild stuff in some of the Gnostic Gospels. This causes early church leaders and later church councils to declare Gnosticism as heretical, meaning false teaching.
Right.
And I would add one more that I don't have this written. I don't want to muddy the waters. More so probably in our culture than maybe African culture. I don't know this, but you will hear people say in Western culture, people not Christians, but people in the culture or even so-called scholars, well, you know, the church kicked out the Gnostics, and really they had these gospels, but it threatened the church's power, and so they pushed out the Gnostics. No. Or we had this late teaching and they didn't accept it. No, the reason Gnosticism gets declared heretical is because it did not correspond to the teachings we have in what we know as the canon, all of which was written within 70 years
Right.
of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And
I think that's at least something to remember, right?
And if you read books, like, which is interesting that they pick up on John's writings, but I mean, if you read First John, it's clear that John wants to make them see that the incarnation matters, that Jesus had a physical body. And so it is in some ways battling that pre or proto-Gnosticism. But what you're saying makes sense. I mean, the canonical writers fully believe that Jesus had a human body. So when you have a group that says no, well, that's not gonna fly with the main line of the church. Anyway, okay, I think that's
And
good.
it also goes back to the heretical teachings about Jesus' baptism, where
Right.
the Messiah comes on Jesus at his
Right.
baptism, and
Sure.
adoptionism,
Yep.
where God adopts the human Jesus to be his son.
So Jesus is a human being that then God chooses at his baptism to.
That's
That's
right.
what we're getting at.
And that the church has immediately
rejected that.
rejected that thinking.
Right. Okay. Good.
Number
Hopefully that
4.
helps. And I know
Yeah, I
it's
hope
still a
so.
little, it's hard. It's a hard, it has always been hard for me. And I remember the first time I heard about Gnosticism, I was totally lost. And I still don't have a great handle on it, but I think that gives us something to hold on to there.
I tried to give a succinct answer, and as I was going through it, I realized that I might have been erring again in using terms that may not be familiar.
Well, I think it's pretty good. So, and if we have questions, don't be afraid to ask them in the WhatsApp
Sure.
still. We're glad to answer those.
And to some of our, perhaps some of our students who are on the younger end, you'll learn more as you go through.
Right.
And don't be afraid, as I said in the WhatsApp, to consult a good Bible dictionary or other reference. Gnosticism is one you want to get one that's relatively recent within the last 30 years, just because our learning about Gnosticism has grown exponentially in the last 30 or 40 years.
That's right. Okay, I think we're ready for 4.
4?
Yeah.
I believe this is your question.
Yeah.
I am confused about the two people, John the Baptist, or this is me saying John the Baptizer, as he's really called in Mark.
Right.
And John the disciple of Jesus. And of the two, who wrote the book of Revelation?
Okay, here's the problem. You got a lot of Johns in the New Testament, right? When I have Bible study on Monday morning with a group of men in our church, there's like 4 or 5 of us who are named James and go by some derivative of that name, whether it's Jim or James or Jimmy or something. I mean, it's a common name in our church. And John was a common name in the culture and certainly a common name in the early church. So I want to delineate between some of those Johns. We're not going to go into all of them, but even one more than is in the question. And I'm going to share my screen here to do that. Okay, so several Johns in the New Testament. First of all, we have John the Baptist, or as Dr. Brokaw said, John the Baptizer, which is probably a better way of saying that. What do we know about him? We know that Jesus' cousin, that word's a little hard to deal with sometimes. He's a relative of Jesus, right? We know that from going back before the two are born. Mary and Elizabeth are relatives, and they come together before the two boys are born. So they have a familial connection. We know that he preached in the wilderness in Judea around the Jordan River. He was baptizing people, where he gets his nickname, John the Baptist. And the gospel sort of introduced that before Jesus' ministry. We know that he baptized Jesus in the Jordan River, and we know that he was killed by Herod Antipas, jailed, and then beheaded. So those are some of the basics of John the Baptist that we know. So that's one person. And then we have John, I like to call John the evangelist, and our gospel writers are often called evangelists, okay, because they're telling the story of Jesus, the good news of Jesus. So John the evangelist, or John the apostle. We'll talk about a couple other things. John, who is the son of Zebedee, the brother of James. So we got the sons of Zebedee, James and John. This is him, all right? He's the disciple whom Jesus loved. At least we think that. That's another one that's a little hard to deal with in some ways. But in the Gospel of John, one of the disciples is referred to as the disciple whom Jesus loved. We think that's probably this John, the brother of James.
John,
go ahead.
Well, you may not know off the top of your head either. I think in the Gospel of John, John's not designated as John.
Right, that's right. His name's never used, I don't think.
His name's never used in the gospel.
Right, I think that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Associated with several books. And the reason I say associated is because if you read the scholarship, okay, you're going to get some debate over who wrote the gospel, who wrote the three letters that are attributed to John, and who wrote Revelation, okay? We don't have time to cover that debate today. Okay, but as you know, who do we sometimes talk about as the writer of the gospel, the three letters, and the book of Revelation is this John. And so I've listed those: the Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and then Revelation. So we think of this John, John the Evangelist. We call him that because he's associated with the gospel. Though remember, the earliest manuscripts of the Gospels don't have an author associated with them. That comes with tradition later on from church fathers and other writers. So it's not like it says, hey, this is the Gospel of John, the brother of James, the son of Zebedee, at the top of it. But the early church seems to think that he had something to do with it.
They're all anonymous, is another way.
Exactly right. And that's true. That's true with all of them. Right?
Yeah.
Is none of them have a name attributed to them on the oldest manuscripts that we have. Right. We don't have the original, so we don't know about that. So we know that about this John the Evangelist. And remember, there's John Mark too, right? Relative of Barnabas, accompanied Paul on the first journey with Barnabas, but didn't finish. That causes a dispute between Paul and Barnabas. That's such a sharp disagreement that Barnabas takes John Mark and goes his way, and Paul takes Silas and goes his way. And John is associated with the gospel, or John Mark is associated with the Gospel of Mark. And again, we don't have Mark's name at the top of the oldest manuscripts, but the early church seems to think that he's connected with this gospel. So at least one more, referred to that's right, in Colossians 4, verse 10, where Paul speaks about Mark. So we can stop the sharing now, if I can get back to it. There we go. Okay. So there's at least 3 important Johns in the New Testament, and that's some of the basics of what we know about them. Though, as I said, if we had top level New Testament scholars in here, they would probably want to debate at least some of those issues, but those are the basics of what we know. Anything you want to add? Maybe you got another John you want to talk about. I don't know.
I don't want to complicate things, but yeah, we could talk a lot about it. I would just say that some people refer to the writer of Revelation and 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. They use the terminology John the Elder,
right? Which is what he calls himself.
Is that a different one than John the Apostle? And some people even just call him John I've heard him called John the Revelator.
I have too. I have two.
That's mostly in a gospel song, I think,
Yeah.
but so, um, yes.
All to say
Back to the
there's
original
more to the
question.
story, right? I mean, we're not
Yes.
claiming we're covering all the as we've talked about, all the introductory issues to the gospel, the three letters, and the revelation itself. We could spend an hour on each one of those easily, plus
Sure.
to talk about what the scholars have written about all that. But
Did-
the
did-
point is to try to delineate between those men. So
Right.
hopefully we've done that.
And to delineate, good word, or distinguish between the two that the question writer mentioned. John the Baptist disappears early in the
Right.
story. So he could not have written any of the letters or writings that are associated with John.
Right. He appears early in the story, even before Jesus in Mark. And then he disappears, and because he dies, he's done. And so, right, he doesn't write any of those letters because he's long gone by that time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very
Hopefully
good.
that helps.
I hope so.
Yeah.
It helped me.
All right. Number 5. You want to read it?
I will read it and gladly let you answer.
Okay.
In the Old Testament, we are told of Elijah having to have gone to heaven. How true is this? And we are not told of his grave, what actually happened.
Well, as with many of these questions that you have given us, they are a challenge. And I think I have to be really careful on this one and tell you what I know, and then probably stop talking pretty quick after that, because I'm going to get into the realm of what I don't know. And I don't want to tell you more than I know. So what does the Bible actually say about this? 2 Kings chapter 2, we have the very end of Elijah's story, and Elijah and his successor, if you will, as a prophet, Elisha, two of the greatest prophets in the history of Israel, are together. And this is what it says. As they were walking along and talking together, suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them, Elijah and Elisha. And Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. Elisha saw this and cried out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel. And Elisha saw him no more. Then he took hold of his garment and tore it in two. So, where's Elijah after this? Well, all we get is he's in heaven. How does that work? Nobody else seems to go to heaven after they die, and Elijah doesn't even seem to die. He's just gone. I can't tell you I fully understand this. We don't really have a lot of other instances that are anything like this. We do have, Genesis chapter 5, the only other instance of something like this. Verse 24, Enoch walked faithfully with God, then he was no more because God took him away. We get even less information about Enoch in that story. Was it like Elijah? Well, maybe, or maybe this is something totally different. We don't know. But what we do know is that Elijah is said to have gone to heaven, and that's about all we know. And I'd be afraid to say a whole lot more because I don't know a whole lot more. So maybe Dr. Brokaw can explain that and clear it all up for you in a way that I have.
Gosh, look at the time. Really, I need to go here in just a few minutes. So no.
Oh, there was one more thing before I stop. Let me give you one more thing
Sure.
that I was going to say. Just from Malachi, just to have this in here as part of the context. This is late in the Old Testament. Malachi has this prophecy. See, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before that great day. He's talking about things that are going to happen in the future. Great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the hearts of the children to their parents, or else I will come and strike the land with total destruction. Now, again, I don't want to get into the full meaning of that prophecy because I can't say I've studied it. But what I'm getting at is by New Testament times, everyone was expecting Elijah to appear before the Messiah. And so that's why some people think, well, John the Baptist must be Elijah having come back to introduce Jesus as the Messiah. So this was an expectation as a fulfillment of what Malachi has to say, which comes much later. But anyway, I just thought it was worth throwing that in there to give the context to what we see in the New Testament. Okay, now, anything you want to add to that brilliant
I would
answer?
add this. Let me, real quickly, I'm doing this on the fly, and let me see if it will let me share my screen. And let me find the right one. Okay. You have Elijah showing up in Mark and the
Okay.
other gospels.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So after this is Mark 9:2-4. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James and John with him and led them up to a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. So we have Elijah showing up again in the Gospels, and traditionally, well, I don't know, traditionally may not be the right word. I'd always seen it as Moses representing the law,
Right.
and Elijah the prophet.
Right.
I think there's some other views on their significance there, but Elijah shows up again at the what we call the transfiguration of Jesus. So, but on the other hand, Moses dies,
right,
and is buried.
God buries him, right?
Isn't that how it's written?
Yeah, I
at
think
the very end of Deuteronomy,
God buries him.
God buries him. So Moses is dead. Elijah, from what we can tell, doesn't die a physical death unless it takes place
after he's
as
taken
he's
up.
caught up in the whirlwind.
Right.
And we have no way of knowing that. And as you pointed out, you have Enoch would be the only other, right?
Right.
Off the top of my head.
That's the only other one that I know of. Deuteronomy 34:5, and Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab in the valley opposite Beth Peor, but to this day, no one knows where his grave is.
Yeah. I think there does become some Jewish tradition that Moses didn't actually die. I think you have that in some of what we call the apocryphal works, but
I guess the only thing I'd add to what I've said is that this seems to be a unique thing, right? I mean, we send, other than maybe Enoch, and we get so little there, it's hard to know exactly what happens. This is not much it's something we can't extrapolate much from. In other words, we can't take what happened to Elijah and know how does that affect how we understand our own deaths or the death of anybody else. It seems so unique that I don't know that we learn anything more about life, death, and the beyond from that passage.
Better to say less than more.
Yeah, because I'm afraid I get into what I don't know, which I may do in the next question too.
I was thinking about this, and it's a very good question. I want to, but I think it also points out, as I was thinking about it, to our brothers and sisters, don't spend too much time on unanswerable questions. Right. I think it's good to ask it, but people can get stuck on unanswerable questions.
Right.
And don't be afraid. We're going at our church, we're going through a series about sharing our faith. Don't be afraid to say, yeah, I don't know.
Right.
If somebody asks you.
Right. And I think that's okay. And as a teacher, preacher, when you don't know, say you don't know, it's okay.
And also distinguish between what scripture says and what may have been said in other contexts.
Speaking of that,
yes,
let's move to our last question, because there's a whole lot of that in this last question.
I don't remember the last question, so
yeah.
maybe this is when I thought. Oh, yes. I'd be so eager to hear. Well, you said you were going to handle this.
I got it, but
All right, because before I read your email, I was going to Google it.
well, I did a little Bible dictionary digging and biblical, encyclopedia digging and a little online research to come up with an answer, but I'm not confident. We'll put it that way. But
I would be so eager to hear how each of the apostles died and the places of death.
okay, here's my beginning of my answer. Yes, I would too. But unfortunately, we don't have a lot of information on most of them. I would be very eager to know more about this, but I can tell you some. And then I can tell you a lot of, here we go. A lot of this is based on tradition that's out there that, we have to remember that in the ancient world and in the early sort of the first centuries of the church, you had a sort of a genre or type of literature that was a hagiography, which means it tells the story of a saint. And they were not always designed to be factual biographies of a person's life as we would in this century. And so it's good for us to read them in their cultural context, which is they're trying to build up the tradition and the image of this person as a follower of Jesus. And so some of it may be true and some of it may not be true, but we have to be careful. I can say there are some church traditions which say this, but I don't know this to be true. I'm giving you a couple of things that we do know from scripture and many things that come from some of those traditions, and even the traditions themselves are very mixed. So here we go.
And I would also add some of it is local propaganda.
Yeah,
some of these stories come out of a particular community wanting
absolutely
to have some claim to fame.
Right, and to say we have the relics or the bone of this person's body, and so come visit us because then you'll be here where it is.
It's interesting.
So that's reading. Right. Yeah, right. And maybe some of it's true. We just I almost hesitate to lay it out there, but it doesn't hurt to know what the stories are. And I don't have the whole stories, but what the tradition says.
I'll be interested to hear it.
Okay,
by the way, and except for the scripture, most of it's hundreds of years after the fact.
Right. That's right. Judas Iscariot, we know. He hanged himself. It's in Matthew 27. It's also, we know a little more from the book of Acts as well. After he betrays Jesus, he commits suicide. So we know that one, it's in the Bible. We can bank on that. James, the son of Zebedee. So John's brother that we talked about earlier is killed by Herod Agrippa. That's in the book of Acts. Ooh, I had the reference down and then I didn't.
Is it Acts 11? No, 12? Acts 12?
Yeah, right in there. And I'm sorry I didn't keep it in there. Maybe
talking off.
Yeah, fine. I'm sorry. I thought I had it in there and I didn't.
That's okay.
Okay, so we have that one for sure. Early church. This is pretty early in the life of the church. So we have one, he's the first apostle to be killed as a martyr because of his faith. So we have that one. We know those two. After this, it gets less and less sure. For Peter, Simon Peter, tradition tells us he died in Rome, something around 64 AD. Dr. Brokaw talked about the Common Era. So you begin to see this more often in scholarship as CE versus AD. I've used the older term just because I thought you might be more familiar with that. So if you see 64 CE, it means same thing as 64 AD. Possibly crucified. Tradition says that he was crucified upside down because he didn't feel like he had the right to be crucified as Jesus was. Did you find the James passage?
It's Acts 12:2.
Okay, thank you.
He's referenced James, brother of John.
Okay, James, brother of John, which would be the son of Zebedee.
Yes, but in that particular passage,
it's John's
he's
brother.
James, right?
Okay, fair enough.
Brother of John.
Okay, there's
Acts 12:2, and then of course it goes into the story of Peter's imprisonment.
Right. So it's a dangerous time. Okay. Andrew, this is getting less. These are just stories that are out there. Traditionally, he ends up in Greece, what we now call Greece. and he was tied to a cross and left to die of exposure, basically, and hung there for 2 days.
Which is the way people usually died.
Yeah, a common way. Right, exactly right.
There's some traditions connecting him to Scotland, right?
There are, and I expected that would be what I would find, but I didn't find that in most of the places I looked, because I mean we have St. Andrew's Cross, right?
Right, right.
So I
And
don't
he's
know.
the patron saint
Right,
of Scotland,
right.
and has a very fine university named after him,
There you go.
and a great golf
A
course.
golf course, right? That's what. We're here to give you the more important information.
No, that's my job. The master of trivial.
John, this is John the Evangelist, not John the Baptizer. Traditionally dies late, I should say late in the first century. Traditionally dies late in the first century, traditionally the last of the apostles to die, possibly on the island of Patmos, though I saw some things that said possibly in Ephesus as well. And we know his name is associated with Ephesus, but I don't know that I'd ever heard that he may have died in Ephesus. Anyway, that's tradition. Philip, traditionally crucified in Hierapolis, which we've talked about a little bit during our last few weeks together.
And interesting, I was reading a book and it referenced the Philip in Acts 8.
Yeah.
Having been with Jesus, but they're different Philips.
Right. And that's one of the things that is worth noting, that for several of these apostles, there is confusion with another New Testament character, like the question about John the Baptist and John the Evangelist. Yeah, Philip here is an apostle. We also have Philip the Evangelist. We sometimes say, though he didn't write a New Testament book, but he was an evangelist in the book of Acts. And their traditions do get crossed up many times. So that's a good thing to mention, and we'll see that elsewhere. Bartholomew traditionally dies in India or Armenia, possibly flayed alive. That sounds like maybe the worst of the possible apostolic deaths to me. But again, that one's
interesting.
guesswork.
The traditions that arise of apostles that the Gospels and New Testament say practically nothing about.
Yeah, right. we know almost nothing about Bartholomew. Right.
Is he also Nathaniel?
Yes. I mean, we assume, right?
Possibly.
Yeah. James the Less. Now this was another one that there's confusion, because just like in my Bible study, there's lots of Jameses around in the first century. And just so you may know this already, but the name Jacob and James are the same name. So in Greek, it's going to be Jacobon. James's really comes later, but it's the same name. But that's in the New Testament form. So these are people who are probably named after Jacob of the Old Testament. But the confusion here is between James the Less, as he's sometimes called, so not John's brother, and James, whom we believe to be Jesus' brother. And, again, we could debate some of the scholarship and the authorship issues, but the writer of the New Testament book by the same name. So this is a different James from Jesus' brother, a different James from the book in the New Testament, but the stories overlap.
Yeah.
So is this the James? Many people believe James the Just, who is Jesus' brother, at least maybe, is thrown off the temple, doesn't die. Then they stone him and he doesn't die. And then they beat him with clubs. But then some people think, no, this is James the Apostle. So which one is it? Hard to say.
Okay. Clubs are always Trump. That's the way.
Well, apparently so. If you can't kill anybody, someone any other way, find a baseball bat.
And James the Less, which I think refers to, is also translated James the Younger.
Right.
Younger than whom we don't know. And isn't he also the son of Alphaeus, if I remember right?
Right.
And Alphaeus is also connected to Matthew, I think. So there may be some relationship.
Well, and and there's where you get crossed over, because it's Matthew, Levi, and Levi's called the son of Alphaeus. So all these things, because we know so little about some of these men,
Yeah,
It is really hard. And certainly when you start getting into church tradition that's 1700 years old, who's right? Well, they may not have even known. Some of this was
sure.
okay. Thomas traditionally is said to have gone to India to share the gospel, and tradition says that he was stabbed, or some, not necessarily with a sword, but some larger implement, a spear, maybe. Not sure on that one. And Matthew, who we just talked about, traditionally in Ethiopia, stabbed as well.
Hmm.
And then Simon the Zealot and Jude, whom we sometimes know as Thaddeus, we think. And this gets confusing because is this the Jude that seems to be Jesus' brother, or is it a different Jude? Some of those traditions cross over. Traditionally, they died in Syria, roughly, possibly together. But that's just, again, tradition. So what I'm telling you is we know about those first two I gave you, but the rest of this is historical sources that we're not super confident in. And as Dr. Brokaw said, sometimes have been created to increase basically religious tourism. But those are some
I'm sorry.
possibilities. Go ahead. No, go
I
ahead.
would say the first two are the only ones we can really be certain.
are.
I think Peter and John, the son of Zebedee, are strong. There's some fairly strong connections fairly early. Of course, you've done the research on it.
Well, I mean, this is
A
cursory.
little stronger tradition about Peter and Rome and John, whether it be Patmos or Ephesus. Well, you would just have to, if he's the writer of Revelation, he's in some kind of exile,
Right.
And there's even some discussion about what that means. But
and we have this story at the end of John's
that,
gospel,
yeah.
But
But there are still a friend, well, a classmate. No, he's not a classmate of mine. He's a little older than I am. But a fellow student of mine from Milligan who has gone on to have a brilliant career in scholarship, takes trips to Ethiopia. I don't know all the ins and outs, where he's doing Coptic. He's looking at documents in the original Coptic, and some of these traditions are strongly held and go back a long time.
Yeah.
So,
and very well may be right. I do not read Coptic, first of all, so I couldn't speak to that.
Really?
But surprising, I know. I wish we knew more. I mean, the question was worded, I would be so eager, and I would too. It would be nice if we knew a whole lot more about the ministries of some of these men, not even just how they died, but if the gospel was taken all the way. I mean, you think about the range that we're talking about here, from Ethiopia to India to Scotland. If that's true, or even close to true, that's tremendously amazing that within a few years of Jesus' death, the gospel would have traveled that far in the first century. So,
and think about this: we know way more about Paul, who's not one of the 12.
Right.
And the 12's just kind of after. We have Peter and John in Acts, and we have these letters that bear their names. But beyond that, gosh, we just don't know hardly anything about
and we didn't talk about Paul's death, and we don't really know about that either. I mean, we have some good guesses that maybe he died about the same time as Peter, but we don't know that for sure.
In Rome,
right, under the same, maybe under the same persecution is what I'm trying to say, and didn't. So anyway. Sure. We do have 6 more questions, so we'll cover that for the next lecture on the questions, and hopefully it's helpful, and we're glad that you were willing to ask them. So thanks for listening.